And so we're super excited for this session today. So I am going to, we've got two presenters and we're going to, I'm going to introduce them and then hand it over. So first, Dr. Eli Wheat. Eli Wheat is a faculty in the program on the environment at the University of Washington, and is also a core faculty member of the Food System Nutrition and Health Program. He's passionate about regenerative food production systems and teaches many courses in food production and sustainability. Co-chair of the Farm Advisory Committee supporting the University of Washington Farm. Has a PhD from UW, a master's in education from New York University, and a BS in biology from Union College. He's won numerous awards for teaching and sustainability work. And in addition to all of that, also has a farm, SkyRoot Farm, the 20-acre certified organic integrated animal and vegetable farm on South Whidbey, so just across the water. In his spare time, Eli enjoys playing guitar, reading, and hanging out with his family. So then we also have Dr. Jonathan Wachter. Oh no, I got your name wrong.
No, that sounded good.
So Jonathan is the lead soil scientist at the Carbon Cycle Institute based in California, where he works to advance the understanding of soil carbon and its interdependence with agricultural management practices. And Jonathan worked at the Marin Agricultural Land Trust and was a member of the Marin Carbon Project, where he ran the organization's climate programs, designing climate beneficial projects on farms and ranches and developing countywide climate strategies for working lands. So Jonathan's background is in soil health research, agricultural policy, and environmental education. He holds a PhD in soil science from Washington State University. So spent some time up here over Mount Vernon as well. So with that, I would love to hand it over to Eli, who's going to kick it off with the carbon cycle.
Wow, Faith, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. And there's like some absolute farming heroes of mine in this room right now. And it's terribly humbling to talk in front of people like Stephen Linné and others who've been farming for so long and have so much skill in this incredible field. So thanks for inviting me, and it's just an honor to be here. We were talking in the beginning about this idea of carbon farming, and I remembered a long time ago when I was an undergrad being in a physiology and anatomy class, and the professor in that anatomy and physiology class was like, okay, class, take out a blank sheet of paper, yeah? And on that blank sheet of paper, just imagine you cut your body in half, yeah? And then draw all the organs that intersect at the line of your belly button. And I was like, okay, like my stomach. I was like, that was all I could get. Like I couldn't think of any of the other organs that would be in that line that would be running across my body in a cross section if I cut it open right then. And other students in the class were similarly baffled by trying to think about our bodies in this way and draw a picture of them. Like if we took a cross section of ourselves at essentially our belly buttons, what would we run into? And when we were talking about this question of carbon farming, I was like, well, what if we just invited everybody to take out a piece of paper and draw the carbon cycle? What would you get? What would you get? Would you be able to do that? And as a practice on that question, I did in fact invite some students here at the University of Washington to draw the carbon cycle recently, and you know they did I would give them a passing grade. Actually, they surprised themselves and me, and when we aggregated their drawings, it was really amazing. So I would invite you to take a moment, if you happen to be near a pen and paper, and just draw for a second what goes into the carbon cycle. How does carbon move in a biogeochemical way on our planet? So I'll let you do that. I'm going to count to 60 seconds. I'm going to give you a minute to do this. And then I'm going to give you a bonus minute because I'm going to read a poem. So you really have 2 minutes to try to draw all the different forms carbon can take and how it cycles on our planet. Awesome. So you can keep drawing and you can begin wrapping up your drawings. I'm just going to read a little poem that's a little bit about the carbon cycle and a little bit about the important time that we're living in right now. Where I think kind of more starkly than any other time that I've been alive, issues of equity and injustice and oppression are really broadly um, broadly capable of being seen, on our planet and in our lives. So I'm going to read this poem by Ross Gay. A small needful fact is that Eric Garner worked here for some time at the Parks and Recreation Horticulture Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he gently put into the earth some plants, which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and to smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it a little easier for us all to breathe. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for drawing your carbon cycles. And I'm really sorry that I'm not super technologically savvy that I could invite you all to like scribble your stuff in somehow electronically. We could see it all appear, but you can compare your diagram to this awesome, look at that. Oh, I love that you just did that. Yeah, you could go ahead and hold your image up to your screens over your faces. There's a beautiful example here that Kathy Morris has made of the carbon cycle. I can't see all of you. You could be holding your sight ears up and I can't see them, but very, very wonderful. And what you can do now, and Jonathan, can we go to the next slide, is just begin to look at your diagram kind of across this other diagram here. And these are just different ways that I might think about, carbon moving in and out of different systems on our atmosphere, right? So the carbon cycle is so amazing and so unique in that I feel like it's pretty neat just to think about all the different forms that carbon takes in our lives and how that makes our lives possible. So we bring in carbohydrates and sugars, and that literally fuels our bodies, right? And like it's pretty amazing. I love that about that carbon cycle, that every time we take a breath, we're breathing in, we're interacting on a planetary way with the cycling of carbon dioxide, right? And plants have this amazing ability to take carbon dioxide and turn that into sugars and other complex molecules like lignin, right? That forms the basis of trees and wood. And of course, carbon cycles in other forms than complex carbohydrates. It also cycles as methane gas, which is an emission that comes from agriculture as well. And there's enormous amounts of carbon stored in our oceans and in our soils. So it's really neat to me to think about how carbon is constantly cycling from kind of this solid form, something like wood that we can, hold and see, and also cycling every moment we're interacting with it just through the simple activity of breathing, which we're all doing. And so it's a really wonderful way, I think, to ground, just to think about how when we breathe, we're interacting with this huge and complicated cycle that, over time. And so maybe, Jonathan, we could go to our next slide. Over time, we've been having some really big impacts. And of course, this is all probably not news to anybody, right? Like, we've been having a really big impact on carbon in our planet. But I remember that it seems like just a few years ago, right, that we have this big movement, 350.org, like let's keep our emissions, let's keep our emissions and the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million. And yet, today we're at essentially 420 parts per million, and it continues to go up. And so it's really important for us to stay focused on that fact. And so this talk, right, is about carbon farming. And I think it's really wonderful to be able to think into a space that's a solution space to this like really big and intractable problem. But at the end of the day, one of the most important things that we can all do is maintain our focus on policy and shifts that need to happen on a really important legislative scale, because independent action is not going to solve the climate problem, right? We need to be focused on the fact that it's fossil fuels that's driving this system, and we need to stop using them. We have so many great emerging alternatives. And so it feels important both to engage in a solution space, but also to keep focused on the problem at hand, which is really reducing the current uptick in emissions. And that number just keeps going up. So one of the wonderful solution spaces, and one of the things that draws me to farming, is the idea that the way we do food production can not only be feeding people, but it can also be part of this solution space. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Which is that I'm really inspired to be farming because of this link between soils and carbon, right? So I think it's so exciting to think about the carbon cycle and be thinking that, okay, plants are growing, like grass is just growing. But like, if you think about a prairie system, like think about the Midwest and the breadbasket, those great perennial grasses, like they're just growing, but like 90% of their biomass is actually underground where we can't even see it. And I think that is just so inspiring. And it's really, really inspiring to be thinking about how I can farm and try to be like a prairie, right? How I could try to do as good a job as the prairies are doing at sequestering carbon and putting carbon into my soil. And so soils have this incredible capacity to be a carbon sink. And as farmers, more and more, especially in the practice of regenerative farming, we're really beginning to focus on how soils can do that. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Jonathan, you're doing so great. Thank you so much for operating the slides. So in regenerative farming, and this is, again, probably an idea that's not very new to any of you, but I really liked how this paper sort of thought about what are some of the themes that go into regenerative agriculture. And they sort of broke down the themes that work in regenerative agriculture into 4 different kind of domains, like planetary health, the health of soil, the health of people, and sort of a healthy economic system, right? And so if you have these sort of 4 different ways, how can we think about what happens on a farm, and how does that translate to these other areas of improvement? And one of the things I really liked about this paper was that on the farm level, pretty much everything going on in this diagram at the farm level in the kind of lower left-hand corner is focused on how we're interacting with our soils. So doing things like minimizing our tillage systems, mixing our farming, minimizing the use of external inputs, practicing strong and diverse crop rotations, utilizing manures and compost, incorporating perennials, and like just focusing on building the health of our soils. And so to me, like this practice of regenerative agriculture feels like a really deep kind of personal commitment to thinking about a personal response that I can make to the planetary crisis. So I'm excited about it. I'm really excited to talk through some of these ideas with you all, hear what's happening on your farms, and together try to work at this system, kind of scaling up each of our individual choices as we work with our soil. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. And one of the things that I love about this slide is just, I think about this all the time, and it's, this comes from like there's a USDA handbook on soils for farmers. And this is super like, I love this graph. It's like, okay, you put in organic matter and don't worry about all the other things that happen. But at the bottom, this magical thing happens, which is you get healthy plants. And it's, I mean, certainly been our experience on our farm that the more we focus on building a healthy soil ecosystem, the more we get really healthy plants with not a lot of work. And so it's really wonderful. There's two parts to this diagram. Just like put in organic matter, get healthy plants. And of course, I'm going to use organic matter, but what I mean there again, and really thinking into that, organic matter is stored carbon. So that's a really important piece of how, when we practice regenerative farming, we're bringing that carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it away in our soils. And of course, grasses, the last slide here, are one of the most fabulous plants at doing this work. And so we'll maybe get to talk a little bit more about that. But the cycles of growth and decomposition that happen below ground with grasses is phenomenal and super inspiring. And today, I'm like over the top inspired by it. And I want to talk more about that, but I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, who's going to kind of take it into talking a little bit about carbon farming and policy and scaling up. So I'll turn it over to Jonathan, and then I'll come back.
Thank you, Eli, and great to see everybody. I have to apologize. My slides are up on this screen, so I can't look into my camera while I see the slides. So sorry about that. Thanks for that great introduction, Eli. So in the title of this talk was this term carbon farming. Eli was using the term regenerative agriculture. I'm gonna just start using the term carbon farming a little bit in my slides. I just wanted to start with this thought that all farming is carbon farming. A friend of mine liked to say that agriculture is the art of moving carbon between carbon pools to produce food. Should say food, fiber, and fuel. Sorry about that. So just keep that in mind as I go through these slides. So Eli already showed this graph. This is the famous Keeling curve, and just showing atmospheric carbon dioxide increasing over time. Just wanted to point out, I'm sure everybody's aware of this, but this is a zoom in on the last 50, 60 years, and I just wanted to remind people about these oscillations in the Keeling curve and where these oscillations come from, and it is the result of seasonal photosynthesis over the course of the year. So when the northern hemisphere, where the bulk of the land is in the summer, photosynthesis is happening globally at a much higher rate, and that's sequestering carbon over that period of time. And then in the winter, you get a release of that carbon dioxide, and so you end up with a higher CO2 concentration globally, and that's what's causing this oscillation on the interannual period time frame. And of course, what we've been doing, both to the land and with fossil fuels, is driving the overall trend up. But I just wanted to, I think it's an important reminder just how powerful these natural climate solutions are, and the fact that we can see it every year. This consistent oscillation is pretty amazing. So Eli introduced this concept that soils are really critical here, and soils actually store a whole lot more carbon than all the vegetation and the atmosphere combined in the world. So you can see on the left here just how much carbon soil stores worldwide. Now, at the same time, soils have lost a whole lot of carbon over the history of humans managing those soils, or mismanaging those soils in a lot of cases. So this graph on the right is from a great paper by John Sanderman from 2017, and it was modeling essentially what how much soil organic carbon we've lost over the history of human management of those soils, and it's really a huge amount of carbon that we've lost from our soils. So there alone, it represents a huge opportunity for restoring carbon back in our soils. And if we could restore carbon back to pre-human levels, then that would be a huge impact on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So of course, climate change mitigation is important, but we all know that we urgently need to be adapting to a changing climate that we're all feeling already. The IPCC just came out with their second report of the sixth assessment earlier this week. I'd encourage everyone to skim through that. Some pretty alarming findings. And so just to say that, we're all feeling the effects of climate change already, and every farm and every ranch is having to figure out ways to adapt to these changing conditions. So the good news here is that many of the strategies that we use to mitigate climate change, in other words, sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, are also building our resilience and our adaptation to climate stresses. So just want to step into some kind of basic theory here for a second. One of the basic building blocks of resilience is feedback loops. And I just want to illustrate these a little bit. So a negative feedback loop allows a system to self-regulate. So a really very, very simple example of this is the more forage you have in a field, the more livestock you can support. The more livestock that are grazing, the less forage there is. And so that ends up meaning that you're going to have, a fairly consistent herd size. That's just a very, very simple textbook example of a negative feedback loop. The opposite of that is a positive feedback loop, which tends to amplify a response, and that can be for better or for worse. And so here's a really classic example of a beneficial positive feedback loop, where having more soil organic matter leads to a better increased water holding capacity, which then leads to more forage productivity, which then can start to accumulate more organic matter, and so on. So that's what some people call a virtuous cycle. So I just want to illustrate this. This is close to where I live. This is in Marin County in California, and this was taken back in the 90s. A ranch that I used to work with quite a bit, and this was after a period of heat and drought on rangeland on these rangelands, and so those stresses led to the producer having to graze pretty hard, and it led to this it's a positive feedback cycle, but in a downward spiral. So increased grazing intensity, you lose the cover on the soil, you decrease your infiltration rates, you start to impact your soil structure, and so on. So this is a picture of the same field. It's a different time of the year, so that's so it looks a lot greener. But this is the same field 15 years later, and this is after some really drastic changes in their management. And those management practices were all about trying to reverse that trend and turn it into this positive, more of a virtuous cycle. So really intentionally managed grazing to maintain soil cover, to start to improve your soils, and so on. So it's a great illustration of these different cycles. And so this is from a figure from Ratan Lal, an amazing soil scientist in Iowa, and here he depicts these cycles. So what he called extractive farming on the left, so this downward cycle, and then conservation agriculture, what he called it, or carbon farming, or just a regenerative upward cycle on the right. So sorry for some of that theory, but I just want people to keep these concepts in mind, and specifically how carbon is really at the core of a lot of these cycles that we're talking about. So carbon farming or agricultural climate solutions are a really essential tool in our global efforts to stop climate change. And like I said before, it's about sequestration, carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas reduction, but also critically, it's about climate adaptation. So carbon, I like to think of carbon as really an energy currency in these living systems. So organic carbon is a source of energy that originated through photosynthesis from solar energy, and that energy that's contained in organic carbon really powers, in a lot of ways, the whole soil ecosystem. So, like Eli, that simplified figure that you showed, which was so funny, that you organic matter goes in and then plant health comes out. If you could think of that as carbon, you can also think of that as energy, and sort of being a source of feeding the entire soil ecosystem. So with that, I want to jump into this concept of carbon farm planning, and this is something that my organization, the Carbon Cycle Institute, has been doing a lot of around California and increasingly across the country. So carbon farm planning, it's a whole farm approach to looking at carbon solutions on the landscape, and it's based around the NRCS conservation planning process. But the key difference is that it always looks at the whole farm or whole ranch, and it puts carbon squarely at the very center of all of the thinking around those conservation recommendations. This figure on the right I like is a kind of just a depiction of how carbon can be thought of as being this keystone this keystone element in the entire agro-ecosystem. So carbon farm planning is also a really important vehicle for increasing awareness and understanding about carbon cycling and about the role of agriculture in climate change. It's also a really important way of building expertise in conservation districts and among technical assistance staff. And what it does, a carbon farm plan, when it's completed, is it provides a roadmap of climate mitigation opportunities, of carbon farming opportunities across an entire ranch or farm. And we like to say that a successful carbon farm plan is about cultivating carbon farmers. So it's really a big emphasis on the learning journey that this planning process is. So the process itself is really heavily about producer engagement, spending time in the field, mapping these different opportunities and estimating what those impacts could be. Of course, developing the plan and writing recommendations. But really critically, it's about also this ongoing engagement and ongoing, and of course, the end goal is to start implementing and ongoing implementation of these practices. So here's an example of a map from a carbon farm plan. This again is in Marin County as well, not too far from me. It's a mostly rangeland, and you can see it's a whole bunch of different practice recommendations across this entire ranch. Some that are probably not going to be implemented for a long time, if ever, and some that are much more near term, much easier to implement quickly. So you can see here, there's recommendations for compost to be applied in certain fields, recommendations for seeding some of these rangelands, recommendations for windbreaks, and this is according to wind patterns in these specific fields, and hedgerows, etc. So I want to just walk through a few of these just general practices, and Eli mentioned a number of these already. So one is windbreaks or shelter belts. So these typically are woody species so they're sequestering carbon in their woody biomass, but they're also giving wind protection to the fields in a way that if they're situated properly, you can actually retain more water in those fields. You can try to increase your crop productivity by keeping more water in the ground, and you're also providing ecological benefits from biodiversity and wildlife habitat. Hedgerows are similar. These are less focused on wind protection and more focused on other benefits. So these pictures show some really great diverse hedgerows that are focused on pollinator resource habitat. Silva Pasture is another great example of. So this is pasture, still grassland, but with a relatively low density of woody species that give the livestock protection, shade, and also sequester carbon in the woody biomass. Reduced or no-till, these practices are starting to be adopted more and more. So this is about protecting the soil, with a good amount of residue on top, and building soil carbon slowly that way. Organic matter amendment. So this, for example, compost, adding compost to croplands and strategically to some rangelands can have a hugely beneficial impact. There's been quite a bit of research in California on dry rangelands showing that just one-time applications of compost can actually start, like I was describing, start an upward spiral of benefit for the soil, resulting in actually quite a bit more carbon being sequestered than was originally added as compost. Cover crops, of course. So cover crops, provide lots of plant diversity, but also can lead to greater carbon storage in the soil, and also produce more forage for if you have livestock in the operation. Prescribed grazing is a really important tool. So there are lots of different terms here, but it's really about very intentionally managed grazing to optimally manage your grassland Eli before this call was just talking about the importance, this important coevolution between grasslands and grazing herbivores. And so grazing practices are all about using your grazing strategically to stimulate your forage growth and thereby sequester more carbon, or just optimize your photosynthesis in that landscape, a portion of which will end up in the soil. Riparian restoration. So this is restoring waterways, streams, and creeks. This is another ranch I worked with quite a bit, and I love this sequence of photos. You can see in 1990 it was a very, very degraded, heavily grazed ranch. You can see this bend in the road for reference. And in the late 90s, they started, just as a family, they decided to start fencing off their creek and started planting willows and some other species. And you can see by just in a pretty short order, you can see how much this waterway has been restored. And so clear ecological benefits, water quality benefits, as well as carbon being sequestered in the woody biomass here. So this is a quote from Lauren Pancha, who's the owner and operator out there, just to say that in his short lifetime, seeing these changes is just really inspiring. Okay, so conservation planning through a carbon lens, or carbon farm planning, it's all about finding ways of increasing terrestrial carbon, reducing other greenhouse gases. We haven't had a chance to talk about other greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide, and recognizing, of course, all of the many co-benefits of these practices. So improved resilience, economic performance, building soil health, water quality and water quantity, ecological health. And then there's quantifying greenhouse gas benefits, or at least estimating some of the benefits that could come from implementing these practices. So I'm going to take a few minutes and go into some of the ways that we can quantify or estimate greenhouse gas benefits. So one is using empirical methods. So there are many publications. This is a great, we call this the Blue Book, the USDA Blue Book, methods for entity scale greenhouse gas inventory, and this provides all sorts of great, mostly national scale data, but that can give you a sense of some sense of greenhouse gas impacts. Looking at local data when it's available and when it's appropriate for your questions, but I do want to, of course, we need to use caution when we're thinking about these numbers and extrapolating these numbers, across landscapes or across different conditions. There are a growing number of models out there, some more accessible than others, that can help give us a sense of what greenhouse gas benefits might be. This is a model, a simplified model called Comet Planner, which is running a model called Descent in the background, and it's designed as a planning tool, and you can see here, this is, you use it by county, and you can choose any number of different systems that you might be working in, and you can choose from a whole suite of different practices. You can enter your acreage, and it will tell you, this is essentially a culmination of many runs across different baseline conditions in this region, and it can give you, it's a really important kind of starting point for, to help you understand what some of the greenhouse gas dynamics are happening behind these practices. So here, this is a nutrient management replacing synthetic nitrogen fertilizer with broiler manure, And you can see here, there's the model. The model suggests that there can be a CO2 benefit, in other words, a carbon sequestration benefit, but that there may be an increase in nitrous oxide emissions from that practice, but that the net result from these model runs is that it'll tend to be a net positive result from that practice. So again, these are our average model runs across a region, so they won't reflect what's exactly happening on a specific field scale, but they do help give you a sense of the magnitude of impact that you might see. Of course, soil sampling is a really important strategy, a really important tool that we have. Actually measuring change in soil organic carbon in a soil is very difficult and can be very time and resource intensive, especially on the field scale. And a lot of this is because we're trying to measure a very small change in carbon relative to a very large stock of carbon that's already in the soil. And I like to compare this to, if you're holding a bucket of water, and somebody puts a drop of water in the bucket, it's going to be pretty hard to detect that change. It's a real change, and it's a real increase in the amount of water in that bucket. But relative to how much was already there, it's just very hard to pick that up with not a very sensitive tool like your arm. And in this case, the way we really measure change is with some pretty intensive research scale sampling campaigns. So I just put this image down here on the bottom right. This just shows over a pretty small field. You can see the X and Y axes are in meters. Just how much soil organic carbon can be variable across a pretty small space. And so that's why, especially for planning purposes, we tend to rely on some of these models and empirical data when we can. And this is not to say that soil sampling does not have a role. Of course, it's a critical tool for assessing site eligibility, for determining nutrient, fertilizer rates, and for other planning. And I also want to just remind everybody of the importance of qualitative evaluation. So just how much we can tell from being out in the field, making observations of the soil, and especially making observations through time can be very, very telling. Okay, so I want to pivot here and just talk a little bit about, I had been talking about field scale or farm scale carbon farm planning and implementation, but I want to just talk a little bit about how this can be scaled up at the county scale, at the regional or state scale, and then ultimately, part of our goal here is to actually have an impact on global climate change. So one of the things that we at the Carbon Cycle Institute have been doing quite a bit is trying to get the agricultural sector integrated into climate action plans on the county scale, and this process is really dependent on local conservation districts, on the counties, on cooperative extension. And the whole point here is for agricultural climate strategies to be really grounded in the local ag community. It's all about building buy-in from the local ag community in those solutions, and ultimately resulting in policies on the county scale that support the ag community and support implementing and planning for these practices. And ultimately, and sorry for the acronym, NWL stands for Natural and Working Lands, just a bit of jargon. But ultimately, by scaling this across enough counties in a state, and having each county and each agricultural community come together and determine just how ambitious and what scale they think they can scale up these agricultural climate solutions. If we can do that across enough counties, we can start to really inform our state goals, and then unlock funding sources from the state level and on up. So here's just an example again of the Marin County Climate Action Plan that I helped work on. And you can see we went through a whole suite of different practices, and this was through many conversations with producers across the county. And what we ended up finding with our modeling was that the agricultural mitigation potential was actually quite a bit greater than what the current emissions from the ag sector are. And so, that was a powerful message to local county government that, by creating policies and funding sources that support these practices, we can start to have a real impact on the local scale. So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of takeaways here. So carbon farming is about adaptation and mitigation, but it's also it can also deliver many other co-benefits that we talked about. These practices have to make sense for the operation, for the farmer or rancher, and they have to be ecologically appropriate. And this whole conversation really has to be place-based and community-driven. Rather than being a top-down process, it's really all about the local environment and the local community. And I wanted to just end by highlighting the importance of local conservation districts in this work, of cooperative extension, of the ag community, and other technical assistance providers in helping scale up this work. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Eli.
Wow, Jonathan, that was awesome. There's like so many things on my mind. I just want to make sure I connect between what you just said and kind of some of the things that are on my mind as I think into it. And I also am like conscious that we have, just to confirm here, we have until 3 o'clock to go, yeah? And we want to make sure that we have time for you all to ask us questions and kind of get into the spaces and thoughts that you have. And I know, like, again, like in this room, there's, a lot of experience and a lot of brilliant ideas about how to do this work. And so I will share a little bit about what we're doing on our farm, and that's just really nearby on the south end of Whidbey Island. And we have a small 20-acre farm there with a lot of things going on. So we've got a small herd of goats. We've got about, I think we have 20 goats right now, and a lot of those goats are pregnant. So there's going to be some more goats on our farm. So we're practicing a lot of pretty intensive grazing. So on our farm, we move our goats 2 to 3 times a week in small pastures. They kind of go out, and the goats have been a really kind of phenomenal partner in the work that we've been doing in sort of reclaiming our farm. Because when we bought the farm, when we started farming on this farm about 10 years ago, the farm was mostly covered in blackberry, and now it's a very much more dominated by grasses, much more open space, because the goats have been literally converting that blackberry biomass into food that we can eat. So we raise meat goats, and they're pretty important in the work of the farm. In terms of the economic bottom line, and we can go to the next slide of our farm, most of our farming, so functionally in terms of sales, comes out of the 2.5 or 3 acres of vegetables that we cultivate, and about 2, 3, actually 4. Golly, the pandemic has like done a lot to my sense of time. It's been like a really the mismatched sense of time. But I guess about 4 years ago, we stopped tilling and we started practicing kind of managing our soils with by hand with a broad fork and a lot of addition of compost. And one of the reasons we have the goats is so that, you know, they come in at night. So they have sort of a nighttime pasture. We collect their manure, we build compost. We have really good relationships with neighbors who bring manure to our farm. And then we have another neighbor who has horses, and we just park a trailer at their farm. And every day they clean their barn and they put their manure in the trailer for us. And all we have to do is show up and pick up this trailer. It's like the most wonderful arrangement. And they're happy for us to take their manure away, which is also just amazing. And so that's been really good for our farm's capacity to grow compost. And the other thing that goes into our compost that's really great is clippings from grass. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've begun to really incorporate grass from sort of edges on our fields, but also in between rows on our pasture and our orchards. All that grass that we mow can be utilized in our compost system. So we go to the next slide. But as we're practicing this sort of reduced tillage, we've been doing all sorts of fun different experiments. We've grown cover crops and tried to kill them with tarps. We use a lot of plastic tarps. I threw in a picture here of a broad fork just in case people aren't familiar, but I suspect most of you are familiar with the broad fork. And yeah, so we grow a lot of mixed veggies. We've been doing a lot of experiments on just trying to figure out what is the best way to incorporate cover crops. And more recently, and Jonathan, this was a tiny little piece of something we showed a picture of, where you had a field where there was a field of barley and then next to it a mixed species cover crop. And we've gotten really excited at SkyRoot about mixes of cover crops, and especially trying to grow quicker mixes of cover crops during the summertime to really take advantage of our solar energy during the summer and pull some of that carbon down into the roots of these mixed cover crop stands. So we can go to the next slide. We have also gotten pretty excited about orchards, and so there's our properties are, you know, it's very undulating landscape. There's like, it's so wonderfully complicated the way the topography of the landscape is. And so we've gotten really excited about some more permaculture techniques and thinking into how we can make use of the slopes that we have. So we've dug some swales to slow down the movement of water a little bit more laterally across a hillside. I was really inspired by the work of a fellow, I think he's from Australia, anyway, dry place, and he's talking a lot about the keyline system. So we've been trying to do some of that in our orchard planting, and really trying to focus our soils to build these fungal relationships by reducing our above ground disturbance of things. And that's been super successful. Yields on our farm have gone up a lot as we've changed systems to reducing our tillage, and now we basically don't till at all, to using compost. And yeah, I mean, the difference in growth has been phenomenal. So we're really excited about what we're seeing. And then, of course, we do cool things like have bees and keep chickens and all that other stuff too. So that's the next slide. And then I got involved a little bit here at UW in a pretty neat project doing some work with kelp. And I'm happy to talk about that, but also don't need to talk about that. I think maybe the most cool thing is I'll just say that I'm kind of excited about kelp as a bioregionally appropriate mechanism for thinking about how we could solve a lot of emergent problems here in the Salish Sea in a pretty creative way to work with, you know, and it doesn't have to be kelp. It could be any marine algae species. And right now, the Puget Sound Restoration Fund is really interested in working with species of sea lettuce that get into aquaculture beds, right, and utilizing that upland to take that problem species out of one system and move it on to terrestrial agriculture and help increase the carbon storage potential upland. And so that feels like really exciting work to me that kind of deals with these two different problem spaces, right? So you've got ocean acidification and you've got the eutrophication of the marine environment. And you can grow marine plants and pull out those nutrients and shift. You can pull out carbon and you can pull out nutrients. And both of those are useful for farms. So I guess I'll kind of leave it there. And I'm happy to talk a little more about this project, but I would way prefer to hear a little bit from you all about like questions that you have and things that are on your mind and what's inspired you as you've been listening to Jonathan and talk a little bit.
Great. Well, we've got a great question here from Kathy Morris to start us off, and I'm just going to encourage everyone to you can put questions in the chat and we'll bring them forward here. So Kathy was asking about let's see. I'm wondering. Let me get back to it. Okay. I'm wondering if plants behave differently in a biologically managed system versus a chemically fertilized system. That is, if we manage the soil for biology, will the plant produce more exudates? Does that make sense? That's Kathy's burning question.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question, and I would encourage us to think not just about the plants, but this amazing and extremely complex microbial environment in the soil, so scientists use this term, the rhizosphere, which is essentially the sliver of soil that's most influenced by roots, and there's just so much going on between all of the different microbes in the rhizosphere and the roots, and there's so many feedback mechanisms. Honestly, many that we're only just starting to get some glimpses of with modern modern technology, and so I think I would tend to think in terms of how sort of very intensive, high input, heavily disturbed soils, how the microbial ecology in those soils can be really different, which means that all of those feedback mechanisms between the plant roots and the microbes can look a lot different. And so I would say that yes, the way partly driven by excess nutrient in the soil, but also largely driven by those microbial populations, that plants will do look quite a bit different, and their responses look quite a bit different in those systems.
Yeah, and I'm teaching this quarter course with David Montgomery, who just recently published a really interesting paper looking at like how plants grown in more regeneratively managed soils tend to have a better nutritional profile than plants not grown in that fashion. So there's like not only kind of what's happening below ground to the microbiological community in soils, but also how that mediates what is happening above ground to the actual health of those plants as far as we're concerned. Yeah, so that's a cool connection point.
So yeah, you can also just go ahead and put your hand up and you can ask the question yourself. So yeah, Sarah Pope just put in, we'd love to hear more about kelp, which I was just thinking. Since we are on islands here. You want to share a little bit more about the kelp, Eli?
Sure, I'm happy to. We might have to share the screen though again, Jonathan, or I could do it.
Sure. Let's see.
Now I've got no idea. Yeah, can you do it? Awesome. Thank you. I do also have a copy of this presentation. Yeah, so just I'll try to go through this kind of quick, so hopefully you'll be able to
Yeah.
think of more questions while I'm talking.
Yeah, there were a whole bunch of other questions that came in too. So.
Okay, great. So this is a picture of Blue Dot Sea Farm, which is, from my farm, only 7 miles away across across the sound. It's just south of the Hood Canal Bridge, and it's located in the place that it's located in because there's a lot of really good exchange of water there. So the pretty impressive amounts of current that can pass through this farm. This farm is 5 acres, and it has a vision of being a regenerative sea farm, right? So they're growing kelp underwater. So what you need to imagine is like suspended down below the surface of the water, there are lines running under the water in a grid, and the kelp is seated on these big cables. I call them lines, but the right word for them is cables. There are cables, and the kelp is seated on the cables, and of course the kelp grows up and then comes toward the surface of the water. Mixed in with that, the farm is experimenting with all sorts of really cool stuff like growing urchins and mussels and other marine organisms that can be well integrated with mariculture, or the culture of seaweed. So it's super exciting. And this is the only kelp farm in Washington State. And that's partly due to regulatory processes that are beginning to shift. So there's an incredible emergence in our state of interest in farming kelp. And right now, Alaska is doing a lot of kelp farming. Maine is doing a lot of kelp farming, but we're not. And we could be doing a lot more kelp farming. So that's a really exciting thing. All right, so kelp is super cool. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, because it grows and it's beautiful, and it's really impacted me in this super incredible way, in a very personal level, which is that I've just fallen in love with kelp. It has so many amazing ties to our history as a people that, there's a anthropological sort of hypothesis that kelp formed a highway for early indigenous peoples settling south, and people knew how they could travel, that they could move south because kelp was such a rich ecosystem and provided so many ecosystem services, especially around food, that it helped people move south from the land bridge as humans migrated south. And so there's this hypothesis called the kelp highway, and so it's really cool to learn more about the indigenous history of peoples here and the relationship with kelp. And so I've just taken up swimming because it's so anyway, I swim in the cold water now, like with the kelp, and it's quite magical. Anyway, the more you learn about kelp, you never know what will happen to you. So just be careful. If you get excited about kelp, there's no telling where you might end up. Kelp does all these great things, right? It removes carbon from the water, removes nutrients from the water, it creates habitat. So then it can be grown in ways so that we can harvest it and then use it as food. So we can go to the next slide. And it's just a big picture of how kelp can interact with carbon in the water. And that's also like just another really beautiful thing about carbon, right? How we are as a species. So we can go to the next slide. So a couple of years ago, I was hanging out in my office and I overheard someone from Washington State Sea Grant, who was involved in this kelp farm, say, oh gosh, we have grown this kelp and we grew a lot of kelp, but the Washington State hadn't yet allowed, then created the rules so that the kelp could be harvested and sold. Because, we have that little green book for producers. There was no classification for kelp. So like the harvest and sale and distribution of kelp from an sort of industrial or human, like agricultural production, there wasn't a way to do that. So they had to create that, and they had to make the rules so that that was possible. And so it didn't happen in time for the first harvest of kelp. And so they had, something like, it was wet. It was like 14,000 pounds of kelp. And so they ended up bringing it in 2 big dump truck loads. They brought it out to our farm, and it was so funny. This big mess, this huge pile of kelp rotting, and I couldn't figure what to do with it. I had no idea when I said yes what that would mean. But so I had at that moment a class from UW, and so we got wheelbarrows and we moved a lot of this kelp around different places in the pasture. And then we watched what happened to the grass, and you could see like squares where we put kelp down, like the grass grew really big, like, no brainer, right? So anyway, so then we eventually worked with Sea Grant to get a little bit of funding to kind of follow this up with a study. And around the same idea of like regenerative pasture management, could we get the grass to grow faster if we put a little bit of kelp on it? And so stimulate the grass growing potential and combine that with regeneratively managed grazing systems and increase the carbon storage potential of the soil, not the potential, but the carbon storage that's happening below ground. So that was the main question that we had. I'm trying to go fast here. And so we set this up. We did different things with the kelp. We put it out on some plots. We had plots where we didn't put it out. We put tarps over some to try to keep the kelp exactly where we put it and to not have as much rainfall. We put remade covering so that sunlight could come through and rain could come through, but birds or other organisms wouldn't move the kelp around. And we just tested what would happen. We looked at, you can go to the next slide. We looked at how fast, what the plots look like. And you can go to the next slide. We looked at how fast grass would grow. So we poked little holes in the grass and measured how fast it grew. We looked at how much grass grew. So we looked at biomass. And of course, we also looked at soil carbon. And one of the things we found was that when we put on the kelp, definitely the grass grows faster. So you can go to the next slide. And there's some of our data. And you can go to the next slide. So then we collected biomass randomly from these meter by meter plots. And you can go to the next slide. And we found out that in the plots that were treated with kelp, there was a lot more biomass above ground. And this is all, really exciting, for me. And so then we were looking at, well, what's driving this? And so you can kind of come down here to the next slide. So, and you can see that that there's more nitrogen in the kelp when there's some more nitrogen in the grass when there's kelp present. So then we also looked at soils, and I'm fearful. I think Doug Collins is in the audience. Like, there's like all these people that I'm very fond of, who are like important mentors in my learning. And anyway, so we looked at soils. You can go to the next slide. And here we took soil samples and looked at organic matter, and it was a complicated story. We haven't, the experiment is going on, so this is sort of just the first set of data that we got back, but yeah, you can go to the next slide. We can find that, we can find that there is, in fact, statistically significant change in the increase in soil organic matter in the plots that were treated with kelp, although it was hard because like we were sampling in the summertime, so there seemed to be just on average more organic matter in the summer in the soils that we sampled than there was in the winter. Yeah, it's just kind of where we're at. But then we go to the last slide. And then again, this just tying this back again to these ideas, like if we as a state start to grow kelp more, then kelp will always be producing a little bit of byproduct, right? And one of the ways that we can realize that byproduct, and again, it doesn't have to be kelp, it could be any marine derived nutrients that we can bring into upland production. We could manage under regenerative grazing systems to really maximize carbon storage in pastures on grounds that aren't being disturbed, in this continuous cycle of disturbance. So again, that's kind of looking towards, like Jonathan was saying, that partnership with herbivores. But a really exciting, I think it's really exciting work, and I'm pretty excited about what we're learning. We're looking into some stable isotope data from the project and seeing some pretty cool results. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Vic.
Wow, that's awesome. That's pretty exciting. And yeah, if you can maybe come on. Yeah, great. I'll share. That's awesome. And then we've got a bunch of questions here. So let's see where our next one was for Jonathan. Was when I was hiking in West Marin earlier this week, I was sorry to see the grass dying already in the areas of thinner soils and grass not growing much before drying. How have you addressed drought with your ranch plans? And can you speak to soil health maintenance in the face of drought?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question and really important. And a lot of it. So of course, with limited water, there are limitations to to how much a plant can grow and photosynthesize. But the emphasis that I usually try to add here is in, to the extent that water allows us, trying to build those virtuous cycles where we can. So so managing soils and managing your RDM to to ensure that you're actually infiltrating all the water that falls. Every little bit is so precious. So you're soaking it up and you're holding onto it as much as possible to then allow your plants to grow. Where you see, those thin soil spots are a great example of a degradation cycle. They tend to get, as they get impacted, they're more susceptible to impact. They get thinner, more erosion, hold less water, less plant growth. So it's a great illustration of those cycles. Thanks.
Great. And then a question from Steve. Do the benefits of adding manure outweigh the burdens of feeding and maintaining the animals?
I would love people to talk about that. I mean, I don't know. It's beginning to feel like a pretty big burden. So we've been farming this way for about 10 years, and it is, I mean, to mix these different kinds of systems, right? So mixing the orchards, the vegetable production, and the animals, it's a lot. And right now, I mean, yeah, there's benefits to having the animals, again, because of the big vision of why we're farming. But how does that balance against like how like time is a limited factor, only in so much of it, and like there's a lot to do. And so I think for us right now, we're in the midst of asking that question and looking at it from a bunch of different ways: the carbon perspective, looking at it from the time perspective, and also importantly the economic perspective, which in our region, like for us in South Libya, is really hard right now because we are having a very hard time getting our meat goats to a butcher so that we can get them butchered in a reasonable time horizon. And so it's like, that's a really good question. And I think that's something that each of us as farmers have to grapple with. But it does really come back to, in my mind, something that Jonathan said, which is that it would be worth it to have animals on our land if we can work with county and state officials to be able to track how much carbon storage that's returning back and how valuable this is to the regenerative systems of our local economies. And if we can track that and then get support from the state and some of the both infrastructural pieces, as well as like having the state work on like helping us get like better access to butchers and distribution networks, like those things then balance the burden in favor of regenerative systems more largely. So it's both an individual consumer producer question, but I think it's a really important structural question for county and local state governments.
Any additional thoughts on that, Jonathan, or should I?
Well, just to say, of course, we all know livestock contribute a lot more than just manure, and so they're just thinking of of the benefits as part of the larger system, both in terms of stimulating grass growth, other biomass management, and of course other products. But yeah, great question.
And this is for Eli. Did I hear right that you were inoculating fungus? And if so, any suggested resources for that?
Yeah, we're not inoculating fungus,
Okay.
but I'm excited about that. And there are some cool books that talk about that. There's Korean natural farming techniques is a good place to go to look up more about how farmers have tried to culture fungal communities to then inoculate into their soils. And the UW Farm is working with a really cool organization here that's doing research on mycorrhizae fungal networks and how they can really stimulate above ground plant growth. And so there's lots of really emergent, super cool work on fungus and how fungal communities can help plants mine nutrients and make them available. So it's cool.
And from Andrew, I'm wondering about carbon markets and if the models that are used to estimate carbon sequestration of various farming practices take into account the quality or longevity of the stored carbon when they calculate how much a farmer is going to get paid. For example, does a ton of sequestered carbon in 1 year through the use of cover crops have the same value as sequestering 1 ton equivalent of biochar, which has a much longer lifespan?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Of course, the carbon market, soil carbon market, right now is really a Wild West sort of scenario. So a lot is going to depend on the carbon credit developer and the standards and protocols that they use. But typically, there is, most protocols. A lot are a combination of models and data and actual data collection, soil sample collection. But most of them do have a time frame, from 10 to even out to some require carbon the carbon that's credited to be stored for up to 100 years. Some protocols. So. Very protocol dependent, but most, every one of these developers is accounting for some period of time. So they wouldn't consider just all the carbon in a cover crop 1 year to be creditable. It'd be spread out over time.
All right. Any additional thoughts, Eli? Should we? Oh, okay. So there's a question about manure, concerns about manure from other farms and broadleaf herbicides from purchased hay. And has anyone heard of it being a problem around here? And I guess as far as like in San Juan County, I can just speak to that briefly, that most of any problem, there is not much that we know of or any that we know of broadleaf herbicide use in the county for local hay production. But if it's being brought from the east side and it's non-organic, that's when you would really want to test or make sure. So like if you're getting horse manure from someone that's getting their hay from the east side that's non-organic, you'd want to look into that. And Eli or Jonathan have anything?
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree with you, Faith. Like, I think in general here on the west side, it's less of an issue, but certainly hay coming from the east side of the mountains is, if it's not certified organic, is something that one would want to be cautious about. And for us, one of the reasons this manure system works for us so well that we worked out with this neighbor is they actually don't use, they feed with hay, but their bedding is not straw. Their bedding that they use is like a sawdust bedding. So in order to build compost, and we don't have a huge compost facility, it's a kind of a small system. So in order to get it up, that's one of the reasons we've been using this fancy mower that collects grass clippings and then we can put it on our piles. And we've seen that just be doing amazing work at sort of creating the heat that we need to get the piles where we want them. Because it's pretty carbon heavy what's coming out from the horses. So.
And there's a question about, do you need to rinse the kelp to remove the salts?
So we were really worried about that, and it's something we've been testing for in the soils. I think here in the west, like west side of the mountains, we're getting enough rain in the winter that it's just rinsing it out of the system. And you know, this kind of practice of going to the seashore and collecting derived organisms and bringing them back up to farms, right? Like it's a very old tradition. Right? That's how Ireland, after they lost all their soil, that was how Ireland got soil back again, right? Was going to the ocean and bringing it up. And so I think it's probably something to be concerned about. Probably a bigger concern is something we've been thinking about too, is mercury that can be in you know, the smelting process that happened here in the Puget Sound in the past.
And there was a question about the legality of collecting kelp. And I think it's
Yeah, I mean, you can collect from the shore. If you have a permit, you have to get a permit on, you know, something that washes up. But I mean, certainly, I would certainly super not urge anybody to collect any kelp. It's growing wildly in our oceans, and especially here in the Puget Sound, there's been quite a large, you know, documented decline in kelp. Kelp beds here in the Puget Sound. It's a vulnerable habitat, and I'm excited about some of the work that's happening with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund in trying to restore kelp beds. And so, yeah, so but all the same, like the, you know, kelp will wash up on the shores, and if you have a license, I believe you can collect like, I can't remember if it's a 5-gallon bucket or a certain weight a day, like in a
well, we've got a couple more minutes. If there's one more question that's burning for anyone. And
Eli, can I ask you a question? I'm curious what sort of rates, like how much kelp you're applying.
We've been really curious about that too. There's a study, there's a couple of studies that have been done about it, and they put more kelp on than we were putting. On a square meter plot, we were putting roughly about 20 pounds of kelp on a square meter. So,
and I was just curious for Jonathan, what your application rates were for compost on rangelands.
Yeah, great question. A lot of the research has been looking at between like a quarter and a half an inch of compost on rangelands. That's what Wendy Silver out of UC Berkeley and Becca Riles from Merced are researching.
All right. Well, we're like coming up on 3 o'clock here. And so I want to thank both of you so much for your time and your stories and all the information that you shared. And it's really fun to have both of you and your both your perspectives together. So it's been super inspiring. And if you have any last parting words, and then we'll say our goodbyes and head off into the rest of the summit and the rest of our afternoons.